Good evening. Good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. We'd like to open to Exodus chapter 13. We're going to be looking at Exodus chapters 13 and 14 tonight as Moses and the people of Israel are preparing to cross the Red Sea. And so we're going to start in Exodus chapter 13, and we've been considering this the first 12 chapters, and of course, you know, we have the plagues, and I figure last week y'all looked at the week before that, I guess, when it wasn't singing night, when I think Johnny did you teach? Yeah, Johnny taught the class, and y'all looked at the death of the firstborn, that last plague that came through, and how devastating that was to the nation of Egypt. And then at the same time, God announced to the people of Israel that they would forever, following this point, observe the Passover every year, and that in the first month of their year, they would remember these events that happened in Egypt. They would remember all the plagues that God brought on the Egyptians. They would remember how God had saved them from the Egyptians, and in particular, they remember how they all stood by the door with their sandals and their coats and their staffs, and they ate the lamb standing by the door with the blood painted over the doorpost, ready to leave just as soon as God told Moses, now it's time to go. And so they leave. And starting in verse 13 then, it almost seems as though we've kind of switched tracks, but really it's all very related. He starts in verse 13 and he says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and beast, it is mine." And so they have left Egypt, and it seems as though it's that same day that they have left Egypt that God begins to give Moses some instructions. And he says, consecrate. Now, how would we define maybe the idea of consecrate? What would we say is a definition, a working definition of the idea of consecrate something? Yeah, it's to set it aside. It's the same idea, to sanctify, to make holy, to purify in a sense, to set aside for the Lord all of the firstborn. And he says, whatever opens the womb, that's just a really old idea of saying whatever comes out of a womb, it opens up the womb. Whatever they give birth to, whether it's from women or from animals, either way, the firstborn, and it'll specify in a few verses from now, he's talking about the firstborn male, but the firstborn, it belongs to God. It's in a sense sacrificed to God. It's for God's purposes. Now, he's going to explain in more detail specifically why that is in a moment. But then he follows in verse 3, and Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for the strength of the hand of the Lord brought you out of this place. And so he repeats, in essence, over and over again, this same idea. No unleavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you are going out in the month of Abib, verse 5, and it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give to you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Verse 7, unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no unleavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters. And he goes on to explain that, you know, someday you'll tell your children about this. And so what word what phrase do we see repeated over and over again in that section? Unleavened bread, yes. Now what's significant, what's important about the bread being unleavened? Well, first of all, what does that even mean? What does it mean for it to be unleavened?
Nothing to make it rise. It's flat.
Yeah, the yeast or the leaven will cause the bread to rise, and so that's how you get, you know, like a loaf or a cake or something. So if you don't put any leaven or yeast in it, then basically you have a cracker. You know, it hasn't risen any. And so then, what is the significance? Why does God make such a big deal here? Yes, Zach?
Well, I may be way off. Seems like last week or when we had class we said something about them being on the go, and it made it more convenient for them to be able to travel.
Yes, I think so. I think that is a part of it, that they
They'd be ready to go. Wouldn't wait for it to rise.
They're not waiting for it to rise. They're not waiting to bake it. You know, you've got to bake something with yeast in it. You can't eat it if it's not baked. And so, yeah, all the things that you do with it, they've got their crackers are much smaller. You can stick it in your fanny pack and go, and so they're much easier. No, not for Steve. They're much easier to carry. That's for sure, Sarah.
Unleavened also it brings to mind sin.
It does, yes. Now, not always. Sometimes Jesus refers to leaven as in a positive light. He'll talk about the kingdom of heaven is like leaven because it grows and spreads. But generally speaking, Sarah is right. 9 times out of 10, when the Bible refers to leaven, it refers to it as a corrupting agent. It changes and spreads quickly. And so Luke chapter 12 and verse 1, in Luke chapter 12 and verse 1, Jesus tells the disciples to watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees. And then he clarifies, he says, that means the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. And so their hypocrisy, the fact that they look one way but they really live another way, will spread among the people, and it's a damaging thing. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and I want to turn there just real quick because Paul really kind of ties all this together for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Starting in verse 7. Now, up to this point in chapter 5, Paul has been talking about a particular individual, a man who is a member of the congregation in Corinth, who is living in sin because he has taken for his own wife, his probably stepmother, his father's wife. And Paul says this is not even something the Gentiles would do. And the church in Corinth is sort of acting like this is normal. They're sort of acting like this is okay. They're acting like he can be right with God living in this relationship. And so in verse 6, he says, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 6, he says, you're glorying or you're boasting about this man's situation is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? If they allow this sin, if they glorify this sin, that's going to spread, and the whole congregation will be convinced eventually that sin is fine. Verse 7, therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, and here's where he ties it back to Exodus chapter 13, Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. And so there's this sort of connection here. There's the Passover lamb who was slain, and his blood was painted on the doorpost. And remember, Moses even says, don't break any of the bones of the Passover lamb. And then you move forward to the first century, and you have Christ, what Revelation 5 calls our Lamb, the Lamb of God, who was slain, and who none of his bones were broken in like fashion, and whose blood is painted, if you will, sort of metaphorically, over the doorpost of our souls when it's applied to us in the waters of baptism. He says, Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, not with the leaven of malice and wickedness. So old leaven, you're thinking Old Testament, you're thinking the ways of the Old Testament. Not with the leaven of malice and wickedness. That's more the idea of what Sarah said, the idea of sin, particularly the sin that 1 Corinthians 5 talks about. But with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, that when we are washed with the blood of Christ, the leaven of sin is removed from our lives, and we are to keep it out, and we are to be consecrated, set apart, sanctified. We are made different. Leavening or unleavening, metaphorically, represents this idea that we are different. And so you see, Exodus 13, God emphasizes to a heavy degree, he just repeats it over and over again, the bread shall not be leavened. It's not that God was just in the mood for crackers that day and he's just talking about what he'd like to eat, he is setting up this picture so that especially come New Testament times, we'll read it and we'll say, this is really important. It's really important that we be unleavened as a people. Now, the question then is, what is the relationship between the consecration of the firstborn in verses 1 through 2 and the unleavening, the feast of unleavened bread in verses 3 through 10? What ties those two things together? What makes them related in this text? Keith?
That's kind of where I was wanting to go with
Well, good.
other contextual clues we have.
Mm-hmm.
Is that he first harkens to the firstborn.
Yes.
And at Passover, who was taken? The firstborn.
Right.
And then Moses reminds them to remember the Passover.
Yes.
any of, what did they get instructed to do? Because like Zach said, they had to be ready.
Mm-hmm.
So they couldn't leaven and wait on the rise. And
Right.
they couldn't, what do they call it, proof their bread.
And no proofing. No sitting in front of the oven stressed that you're not going to make it in time. Right?
So this unleavened bread reminds them, is supposed to remind them of the Passover.
Yes. Yeah.
And the firstborn harkens back also to the Passover.
That's right. Yeah, they both do. And remember, what plague has taken place at the same time that the Passover comes through? The death of the firstborn sons of Egypt. Anyone who wasn't passed over, their firstborn. And that's what God says in chapter 13 and verse 15. Notice 13:15. It says, "It came to pass when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go." This is what they'll tell their children someday, "that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and of the firstborn of the beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem." Well, we'll talk about what redeem is in just a moment, but the idea is he is making a tie here. When they think about their own firstborn, they are to remember what happened to the firstborn who were not passed over in Egypt, and that moving forward, those who are not consecrated, those who are not holy to the Lord, are like the Egyptians. Do you remember what happened to Aaron's firstborn son, Nadab, and also the second one, Abihu? You know, they were technically consecrated, but they offered strange fire, Leviticus chapter 10, before the Lord, and the fire of the Lord consumed them. His firstborn son became unleavened. And then you think, what happened to God's firstborn son? Now, not because he had done wrong, but because he bore our sins on the cross, that it says he took our sins upon him. And so he was crucified because of that. And so there's all of this sort of foreshadowing here about many things to come. But that's, I think, when you get down to it, and I think what Keith is kind of getting at is when you look at that connection there, the Passover reminds them of the firstborn. The firstborn reminds them of the Passover. The firstborn must be consecrated. They must be holy. And that's what the blood of the Lamb did for them. It set them apart from those who did not paint on their doorpost. And so by putting it on the doorpost, they were consecrating themselves. Now they're consecrating their firstborn. It's all really pointing at the idea of the holiness of God's people. God's people must be set apart. Now, if you remember, when we started this study of Exodus, we kind of said, what is the whole big picture of Exodus about? And especially when you get to the very end of the book of Exodus, and it spends chapters and chapters and chapters just talking about how all the details of building the tabernacle of God, the dwelling place of God, and sort of the climactic moment of the book of Exodus is when God shows his glory to Moses, just the backside of it, and talks about his holiness. And then later, Aaron the priest, as they are building this tabernacle, will write upon his hat, "Holiness to the Lord." The book of Exodus is about pursuing God's holiness. And even here, as he's establishing the feast of the Passover that they were supposed to remember every single year, and the consecration of the firstborn. Now, later on in Numbers chapter 3, I think, God will clarify this, and he'll say that he's not actually going to have everyone's firstborn, but that he'll take the Levites as a stand-in for everyone's firstborn, so that they didn't actually have to send their sons to all work in the temple. Just the Levites would do that. He hasn't explained all those details yet, although he does say in verse 13, chapter 13 and verse 13, he says, "But every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb." And so redeem, the idea of to replace it with something else, to buy it back so that it has a substitute. And so why would a donkey not be given to God on the altar? It's unclean. Yeah, so, lambs, goats, pigeon, these are the kinds of things that are considered clean and therefore can be offered. They have donkeys. Donkeys are very useful creatures, but they're not clean. They can't be sacrificed. And so he says, if you have a donkey that gives birth to a boy, then you will not offer it. You will redeem it with a lamb. You'll replace it with a lamb. And if you can't do that, break its neck. But then verse 13 at the end it says, "And all your firstborn of men among your sons you shall redeem." And then at the end of verse 15, you remember he said, "Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all males that open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem." And that's kind of, it's pointing forward to, I think, Numbers chapter 3, when he talks about how they if I had a firstborn son and I was not a Levite, then they would pick a Levite to take his place, so that he was redeemed and a Levite took his place as God's plan. But the point of all of that is God's people must be holy, and so that's the emphasis here. Any thoughts or comments on that before we move forward?
You said something about break its neck.
Yes,
I didn't get all of that.
that's for the donkey, not for the son. So
Why was that done?
the donkey is an unclean animal, and so if they didn't have a lamb to redeem it, it belongs to God. So if they can't use it, for burden or for breeding or for anything like that. But if they can't replace it, then the only thing to do to be right, you can't take what belongs to God and use it for something else. It's consecrated, it's holy. If you can't replace it, then the only thing to do is to break its neck, so that you're not tempted to use it for something else. Yeah, so they didn't do that to their sons, just their donkeys. So yeah. But-
Question.
Yes,
I did one more thing.
You brought it up, so
please.
where it fits. So when you talk about, I know there's a connection between, the lambs had to be spotless, the sacrifices couldn't have anything wrong with them, and the bones were broken, and then Christ had no bones broken. So
Yes.
I can never figure out, how did they nail him to the cross without breaking the bones?
Without
of his
breaking
hands and
bones.
his feet?
Yeah, they were very precise, and there is
Is it everybody? Or just
this is everybody. Now they did, the difference between Christ and others is that, you remember, at the end of the day they didn't want them hanging on the cross any longer, so they broke their legs
Right.
to speed up the death process. They didn't do that to Christ, and I think that's where really this comes into play. As far as that goes, there is sort of a place in your hands and in your ankles, if I understand it right, and I'm not a biologist, but if I understand it right, there is a place in your hands and your ankles where you have sort of a tendon that they would insert it there, so they didn't have to try to crack bone, because it's just too much work, it's too hard. And that was actually more secure. You think if you crack a bone, it's more likely to slide, but if you stick it in that groove, it's kind of like putting a nail in a hole, kind of. And so they could have nailed him pretty easily without breaking any bones. And then he died before the end of the day, so they had no reason to break his legs, which I think is really what that prophecy is about. It's confirmation of his death, that they didn't even need to break any of his bones. But that is a good question, yes. And then was there one more? Yes, Zach.
Just a side note, I've never put together the firstborn and the unleavened bread, and it just kind of shows how much more meaning the Lord's Supper
Yes,
has. I mean,
I think
it's
so.
always meant a lot, but man, he had that plan a long time ago.
A long time ago, yes. That's Zach's referring to when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. He did it on Passover at the same feast, but of course centuries later, and said, "This will represent my body, and it will represent my blood." And you have Jesus, the firstborn, consecrated for this purpose. Yeah, I mean, he really did it all. It's all so interwoven. I think that's a really good observation, Zach. Thank you.
I would add one more
Yes, sir.
small comment.
Mm-hmm.
At Passover, he didn't just pass over and take the Egyptians. He also took the Israelites. He just didn't kill them as long as they followed the instructions given. So they were
Yes.
all redeemed
Yes.
on that night.
Yes. I think what he
Either lost or redeemed.
Yeah, what Keith means is he took the firstborn of everybody. He took the Egyptians' firstborn through death. He took the Israelite firstborn through this consecration that he mentions in chapter 13. He takes all the firstborn, but it just, if you had the blood or not, depending on whether that was a positive thing or a negative thing. And yeah, I think that's a good observation as well. So we pick up in verse 17, and the question that this section, that rest of the chapter asks is, who is this God who saves us? And that's really Exodus over and over again will ask this question, who is this God? And in large part, the book of Exodus is written by Moses for the Israelites who wandered in the wilderness, and he's teaching them how very different God is from any of the idols that they worship, any of the Egyptian gods that they were familiar with. He over and over again asks this question, who is this God? Who is the true God? Because they clearly don't fully understand that, or else they would have had a different response to him. And so he starts in verse 17, and it says, "Then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. I think this is such an important concept for the Christian to think about today as far as the nature of God. What do we learn about the nature of God in verse 17?
He will guide us.
He does guide us, yes,
He's
and
all-knowing. He knew what
he knew
their character and how they would react.
how they
to,
would react, yes,
to not controversy, but
difficulties or trials, temptations. Yeah, I think that's he knew how much they could or could not handle as far as temptation goes. Yes, sir.
Compassionate.
And he's compassionate, and that's you could have said patient. It would be very similar. That's how I worded it. Compassion is fine. He's patient, and that's I think 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, and 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, it says God always provides a way of escape out of temptation. We never have so much temptation that we simply must give into it. There is always a way of escape. Now, sometimes we pass right by it, and that's on us. But it's always there if we'll look for it. And I hear sometimes people will talk about, loved ones or people that they know who fell away from the church or who, went through a time of falling away or something like that. And they'll say, think about his background and think about his past or think about her history. For someone like that, there was just no way that they were ever going to overcome those things. They were going to fall away. It was inevitable. But we're told by Moses here, God knew exactly how much temptation they could and couldn't handle. And when he saw a path that had too much temptation, he said, I will not take them down that path. That's the compassion. He doesn't expect us to be, perfectly mature and perfect Christians on day one. He sees where they are. He sees their weaknesses. He takes them down a path that does have temptations, but not such great temptations that they absolutely cannot succeed. God knows exactly how much you can handle. He will never put you in a position where you can't overcome that. And I think that is kind of, to me, a surprising thing to learn in the book of Exodus. And I think it's such an important thing to learn because I think we really do sometimes begin to feel like, well, it's just inevitable. I can't help myself, or they can't help themselves, or whatever it might be. That's not the way God works. I think I saw a hand somewhere. Miss Faye, yes.
I was going to say earlier that God had the foresight to know that they could and would be tempted.
Yes.
Like He has the foresight to know that we can and will be tempted.
And what specifically will tempt us? And yes, ma'am, that's right. And that's someone I think perhaps as Melanie mentioned. He's all knowing. He knows exactly where our path in life leads, and he prevents us from going down roads that we can't succeed, that we have no hope of succeeding. So verse 18 says, so God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. What quality or characteristic of God do we find in verse 18?
He's a general.
Yeah, I think that's getting at it, certainly, yes. Someone said something over here, I missed it.
He's definitely a planner.
Yeah, he's organized. He's a planner. He knows things. If you go into the book of Numbers, actually maybe in the book of Exodus, I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you go to where it describes how, it wouldn't be Exodus because they haven't built the ark yet, but where it describes how after they built the ark, he made a plan for where each camp would sleep, and then how they would organize themselves to march. And you think, whether it's thousands or millions of people, either way, that is an overwhelming amount of people to have to get up and move over and over again, especially for 40 years. But right from the very start, he had it down to a perfectly scientific T, because God is perfectly organized in everything that he does. Everything he does makes sense. Everything he does has no holes, no flaws, and no questions. Now, sometimes we can't always see fully what it is. Sometimes in our limited minds, we can't always perceive the order of the things that he does. Although I do think that often if you study and look hard enough, you begin to find it. But it always is perfectly organized and perfectly ordered. He does nothing that doesn't make perfectly good sense. And so, as life sometimes feels out of order and chaotic, remember that God takes everything bad and works it out for good. And his logic always succeeds in the end, even when we sometimes do things that are not so orderly and good. So, all right, yes.
See that in creation.
Yes, ma'am.
God had a plan for you, didn't just get out and say, I'm gonna put these stars.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it was all perfectly ordered.
Not just in the creation, but in the explanation of creation, there's a perfect kind of logic and order to it. Miss Sharon.
I was just going to mention that as we've been talking about this and stuff, I was sitting here and thinking about the design of the basket and the
Okay.
weavers that create the basket.
Sure.
And you know how intricate and tiny and small the very smallest of the baskets can be. They start at the base and the weaving, and they've got the sinews that go up the sides and the reeds, but it's all connected.
Yes.
It all starts from one little spot, and it just works its way around it.
And if you get it tangled or messed up, it doesn't
messes up.
become a basket, you know. Yeah.
But then it has the handle, the arch of the handle, and as you do that, you work your way up, and you know, in heaven is the overall.
It's very intricate. Yeah. No,
It is.
I like that analogy. It's a good analogy of something that clearly someone has to have thought out beforehand exactly how it's going to go. But the maker knows exactly how to do it, and that's exactly how our God is. Yes. So verse 19 it says, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. Now this goes back to the last chapter of Genesis when Joseph commanded them to not bury him in Egypt, which is a pretty big deal considering the way that the Egyptians saw the afterlife. But he says, don't do it. For he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, 13:19, saying, God will surely visit you, and you will surely carry out my bones from here with you. And the idea is take it to the promised land where you'll bury me with my ancestors. And so, Moses remembers that, and though he never knew Joseph himself, and he does it. Now this is about Moses and Joseph, but it does tell us something about God. What do we see about God here in this verse?
He's faithful.
He's faithful. Yes, that's, I think, exactly what I said. He keeps all of his promises. It may be that nobody alive even remembers or ever knew Joseph, but God doesn't need that. God knows how to always keep his promises. God knows how to always succeed. He knows how to always be faithful. In verses 20 to 21, it says, so they took their journey from Succoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. Now, I really appreciate this quality of God. What do we see about God here? He is a leadership, but in particular, he is the kind of God who leads in front. You know, he is in front of the troops. He is marching first and foremost, which means, you know, if they were in battle, he would take the first hits. He is up where everyone can see him, so that he can easily be followed. And he's a big old pillar of fire and cloud. You know, he's easy to see. Everyone can follow. If, as Hebrews 12:1-2 says, if you will set your eyes on Jesus, he is big enough. The word paints a big enough picture of him that he can't be missed if you'll watch for him. And you can follow in every footstep that he says. That's what Jesus says. Jesus says, follow me. He has already paved every path. He has already marched every temptation and every trial that we're going to face in this life. He has already gone ahead and he has sacrificed himself, showing the path forward for us. Jesus has shown the way. All we have to do is just step in his footsteps. God always leads the way for us. And then finally, verse 22, it says, he did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. What is the significance of him not taking it ever away from them?
He was always with them.
Yes, he's steadfast. He was always with them. I think the idea is they can always see him. There isn't a moment where he disappears and they can have doubts that he is not there with them. And that's, the idea of reassurance. That's, what the whole book of 1 John is about. It's our pillar of fire and cloud that gives us our reassurance that we know right where God is and right how to be walking in him. I saw a hand over here, I think. Okay, Keith, yes.
I was going to ask you a question.
Yes.
I've always had a wonder about this.
Sure.
Because he led them to the wilderness to avoid conflict. Could anybody else see the fire and the pot? Or was it just the Israelites?
Well,
Because he didn't, you know, if it was the other way, you would expect that maybe they would have had some conflict prior to the Red Sea.
yeah. Yeah, the only thing that I could think off the top of my head about that is in the next chapter, God is going to come between the Egyptians and the Israelites, and it's going to be light on one side and dark on the other side. And, you know, you kind of think how unfathomable to the Egyptians. But, you know, I don't really know for sure how to answer that question. It's a good question. Could anyone else see it? I can't think of a place where the Bible specifically addresses that and ever talks about another person admitting to seeing it. But you would think if somebody else could see it that they would just steer clear of something like that. You know, it's
Maybe.
pretty unusual to see. And so, yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to think about that. So, yeah, thank
Some
you.
of them Egyptians chased after them after what all took place
Yes,
in Egypt.
I know. I don't think that the pillar of fire and cloud being with them would necessarily stop them. Pharaoh's heart was that hard, and so he still
They
somehow
didn't need
thinks,
They didn't need that fire.
No, yeah.
Possibly millions of people.
right.
The track they would leave.
Oh yeah, no, easy to find. Yeah, easy to find. Yeah. Kenny.
Archaeologists today have found what they think is the area that they went down the Red Sea because the soil had been converted to rock.
Yeah.
Been so hot.
Oh, I see.
It literally melted sand in the glass almost, you know.
Right.
And so if it was that hot, it sure was gonna fall very close.
Well, we are going to talk about that actually in just a moment, about where did they cross. But yeah, I think that's interesting. So, but yeah, he is our reassurance. This is who God is, and as always, he's comparing this to Pharaoh, who is nothing like this, and he's comparing this to the Egyptian gods, who are more like faulty humans than like gods, and saying, why would you choose anyone else to follow? And I think the same question is true for us today. Of all of the false religions and all of the temptations in the world today, none of them are like this. Why would we choose anybody else to follow? All right, chapter 14. We'll at least begin it tonight. We'll get as far as we can. Chapter 14. They're leaving Egypt. It says in 14:1, now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi Hahiroth between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea. And so this is really just a description. If you go back to chapter 13 and verse 20, it's describing the route that they took. And actually, if you go back to 12:37, this is where it starts. Chapter 12 and verse 37, when they leave, it says they left from Ramses. Now we know from early in the book that they built the city of Ramses, and that the Israelites built the city of Ramses in Egypt. And they left Ramses, and they went on, and in chapter 13 and verse 20, it says that they left Succoth and camped in Etham. And then in chapter 2, it's describing how they went from Etham on to the very edge of the Red Sea. And so the question then is kind of, where are they when all this is taking place? If you can see the map, I tried to make it as big as I could. So up in kind of your right-hand corner, that's the promised land, future Judah, where they're going to someday. And then you can see kind of just south of that is where they wandered for 40 years. And then over on the far left corner, you have Egypt. And so they're going from one to the other. And when it says they didn't go the route of the Philistines, that's the really obvious path that you would take on the farthest north corner up there. That's where they didn't go. They went south instead, because God knew they weren't ready to take that path. Now, the part that I marked lakes, this is where most biblical scholars and most of the denominational world will tell you is where they crossed. Over these lakes right there, they just went slightly south and crossed over one of these small 3 lakes. Probably, most people say the southernmost lake right there. And you think, well, that seems possible because the lake is, pretty big and God could separate it. But the problem is, those lakes are only 3 feet deep. And while it's true that you can drown in a lake that's 3 feet deep, you can drown in 6 inches of water, I think. It's hard to imagine a lake that's 3 feet deep covering an army. That's fairly implausible. And so, and it sort of takes away from, you could cross a lake of 3 feet without the waters parting, if most people are taller than 3 feet. You could cross a lake like that without the waters parting. Why were they so panicked? Also, if you just look at the area there, this is a topographical map. So as you go south on the edge of the Red Sea, you can see all those mountains down there where a person could get trapped. But up there, there's no mountains. There's nothing to trap them. And so why were they so panicked about about Pharaoh's army? What would cause them to panic if they were just going to cross by or over one of those lakes up there? And the reason why they say that is because literally Red Sea it really could be translated the Sea of Reeds. And so, these lakes up there, they have lots of reeds and papyrus kind of plants inside of them. And they say, well, what's intended is that they crossed the Sea of Reeds and not the Red Sea. If they wanted to say the Red Sea, they could have. They said the Sea of Reeds, so they crossed over the lake. But I want to notice for just a moment 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 26. 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 26. 1 Kings chapter 9 is taking place during the reign of Solomon. And of course, Solomon expanded the territory of Israel farther than any other king before him and any king after him. And in 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 26, it says, King Solomon also built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And so if you look back over to your right, down south of Judah, you can see how far Solomon's kingdom extended, way, way far south. And I tried to make it big, that red dot that says Elath. And you notice that branch of the Red Sea, that big branch that he was putting a fleet of ships on, right? So it's basically, it's a sea that goes into an ocean. That's what the Bible is calling the Sea of Reeds. And so we can see that just because it calls it the Sea of Reeds doesn't mean it's talking about tiny lakes. Why did they call it the Sea of Reeds? I think probably because papyrus grew along all the edge of it, and that's probably why they called it that. I don't know specifically why they called it that, but the Bible uses that phrase, Sea of Reeds, for the big giant bodies of water, not just for those little bitty lakes. And so now, how then do we determine where they actually crossed over? It says that if you go back to Exodus chapter 14. Exodus chapter 14 and verse 2. It says that they camped at a place called Pi Hahiroth, and that is the exact way you're supposed to say that. I guarantee it. No, I don't know. So Pi Hahiroth. It says it's between Migdol and the Red Sea. So I tried to mark about where Migdol is. Can you all see that on the map up there? Just north of what we would call the Red Sea. And again, people say, well, Pi Hahiroth must be north of it because they camped there before they crossed over one of those lakes. But it's equally logical, and maybe more so, that it would actually be south of that. You can see between Migdol and the bigger body of water, the Red Sea. And then it says it's opposite Baal Zephon. And that, I also think, tells you that it's probably south of Migdol for the bigger body of water, because we know the word Baal, right? Baal is the name of a false god. So probably Baal Zephon is a town with a temple to Baal or an altar site. Well, where did they always put their altar sites in the Old Testament? They call them the high places, right? Up on a hill or up on a mountain. And you can see all the mountains are south of Migdol. In fact, Migdol is kind of the beginning of those mountains. And so you're looking at a place that's really high up, somewhere between Migdol and the Red Sea. So as we keep looking, this is now on your right, that's Google Maps right there. I went to Google Maps and I did a search. And you know how you can pick walking on Google Maps? How far does it take to walk to, Telly's, and it'll tell you, well, it's going to take you 7 years to get there if you walk. So yeah, I did a walking from the place that they started. It says Succoth, and down to the edge of the Red Sea, down there past Migdol, about, I don't know where, but about, and that is about a 3-day journey, which you think originally they asked to go how many days into the wilderness? 3-day journey. So it's like, the lakes are not quite far enough if they're wanting to go 3 days. It's about a 3-day journey to get down to the actual Red Sea. And so you can see this is on your left side is the ancient map, Migdol and the lakes down to the Red Sea. And then this is Google Maps. You can see, Google Maps says it'll about take 3 days to walk there. So if you trust Google Maps, that's about what it says. So then it puts you on this point on your left side, and this point where they would have probably gotten to about where it kind of sticks out there into the very top of the Red Sea. And they would have just walked right on down there. It would have taken about 3 days. What's interesting about that, as we zoom back out, so you're back, there's Migdol on the very top of the Red Sea on the left-hand side of the map. What's interesting about that is the thinnest neck of the Red Sea. That's the place where there's the least amount of space from one shore to the other. And you know, I can't say this for certain, but doesn't it make sense that God would have taken them to the place that has the least amount of ground to cover if they're going to be crossing from one side to the other, to the thinnest part of the Red Sea? Now, it's not a lake, it's a deep, deep sea. They would have had big fish and all kinds of things swimming in there, but that's the thinnest part of it, right about a 3 days walk from where they originated. And then from there, if they crossed over right between those two errors in the thinnest part, it takes about 3 days to walk to, you can see maybe on the left side it says M-A-R-A-H, Mara. Anyone remember what Mara means? Naomi names herself this after she has bad times. Bitter. Why did they name the place Mara? Just a couple chapters from now. Anyone remember?
Water.
The water was bitter. Now there are wells and lots of water. There's a place called Pharaoh's Well and all kinds of places like that with lots of water down there. If you skip ahead to chapter 15 and verse 22, chapter 15 and verse 22, it says, right after they cross the Red Sea, chapter 15 is when they sing their great song of victory. And the very next thing that happens, so Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and then they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And then the next verse says, when they came to Mara, they could not drink the waters because they were bitter. So you can see from that spot where they maybe would have crossed, the thinnest, the skinniest part of the Red Sea, if they walked 3 more days south, that's about even with where they suggest possibly Mara is. And so you've got 3 days journey to the Red Sea, they cross over, 3 days journey down. Now, I am not saying that this is definitely and positively and surely the spot where they crossed. I'm just saying that it makes a lot more sense than they crossed the lake. And you can see more than one option of where they could have crossed, but to me, based on how far they had to walk, this makes the most sense. Miss Sharon?
Just a comment, and Stephen will talk here for a minute, but we had a speaker from a few years back, and Linda and David Rawls, and he talked about the history of this, and he had made journeys over to there.
Okay.
And if I remember correctly, he talked about the crossing of the Red Sea and them finding chariot wheels in the
Sure.
that area and stuff.
We watched a couple of videos too from
Yes, we had videos on
Yeah.
it, so, and markers on both sides of where, but I don't know.
Yes, there's a lot of information out there, and it's hard to say conclusively always how much of it is really legitimate, and people are always sort of making these things up to a degree. I'm not saying that one is made up. It very well could be true. I've looked into the ones that I've seen, and I've never found one that I feel really confident was, that they'd actually found the things that they said, but that I wouldn't be surprised if it were, because it makes sense. So, yes, sir. Oh, yes, sir.
Well, it has to be long enough to swallow the whole army.
Yes.
Half of them got up here and saw that half in front of them drowning. I doubt if they'd get in the water.
Yes, yeah.
It's gonna have to be pretty long.
I think you're right. Yes, sir.
Another thing that could throw them off is, I witnessed when they built Lake of Pine, they used to be a big lake. And right now, you can walk across the lake and you eat places.
Sure.
That's why I went to the side, take off across the lake, walking, if
Yeah.
you could get the mud.
Yeah,
Mud
yeah.
would get you there.
That's what I was gonna throw in, Scott, is two things, what Kenny's saying is, all bodies of water that are impounded eventually go back to marsh.
Yes.
This is several thousand years ago, so
Right.
we got some opportunity for some things.
Yes.
Plus, it was pre-global warming. We have no idea how much water.
It could, and that's always a possibility. It could be very different. Yeah, it could be very different. And so there's lots of different suggestions. But sometimes people try to use these lake things to say that the Bible isn't true. And so I just like to point out that at least there are explanations that do match the biblical record and that do make sense. It doesn't have to be the right explanation. but that there are explanations that do make sense. And so, just to summarize, they would have left the north, they would have gone down past Migdal to that very edge of the Red Sea. They would have possibly crossed over there, and then they would have walked down to Mara. And then from there, they would have gone south to Mount Sinai, where they continued what they were doing. And so we will wrap it up there tonight. We'll finish up chapter 14 next week, where we look at more detail from an application standpoint about crossing the Red Sea. So thank you for your attention and your comments this evening.